Picture this. A blacksmith named Ali Kache stands in a darkened alley in Isfahan, Persia, November 1387. His hands are blistered from the forge, his leather apron still dusted with iron filings, and in his fist he holds a weapon he made himself, a short, ugly blade with no crossguard, meant for close work in tight spaces. Behind him, crammed into side streets and doorways across the sleeping city, are hundreds of craftsmen, tanners, dyers, and butchers, men who have never held a sword in their lives. Ali gives the signal. By dawn, 3,000 Mongol soldiers are dead, throats opened in their beds, skulls caved in at their posts, tax collectors found slumped over the very ledgers they'd used to extort the city's wealth. The people of Isfahan, poets, astronomers, carpet weavers, have done something no army on earth has managed in 17 years of continuous warfare. They have humiliated Timur. The news reaches his camp outside the city walls. The man they call the Sword of Islam sits motionless on his horse, his right leg locked permanently bent in the stirrup from an old arrow wound that fused his thigh bone to his kneecap, his right hand missing 2 fingers, his red beard catching the morning light. He says nothing for a very long time. His advisors know that silence. They have seen what follows it. Then he gives an order that will echo through 6 centuries. Every soldier in his army, all 70,000 of them, must bring him 1 severed head, not a prisoner, not a hand, a head, and he will pay 20 silver dinars for each one. This is the Massacre of Isfahan, the story of how one city dared to fight back against the most lethal human being who ever lived, and what it cost them for trying. Before we get into the full story, and trust me, it only gets worse from here. If you're the kind of person who loves the history they never taught you in school, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Like the video if you learned something new today. Let's get into it. In 1336, in a patch of Central Asian steppe about 50 miles south of Samarkand, a baby was born with a clenched fist full of clotted blood. His father, Taragai, a minor noble of the Barlas tribe whose name translates to lark, looked at that tiny blood-soaked hand and named the boy Timur, Iron. Remember that name. Remember what it means. It will matter later when a Soviet scientist opens his coffin and reads what Iron wrote on the lid. Now here's the first thing most people get wrong about Timur. The West remembers him as Tamerlane, which sounds almost romantic, like a knight from an Arthurian legend. That is a corruption and an accidental insult. The name comes from the Persian Timur Ilang, Timur the Lame, a mocking nickname his enemies gave him after an arrow shattered his right leg and withered his right arm during a sheep-rustling raid in his 20s. His thigh bone fused to his kneecap. He dragged that leg for the rest of his life. His left shoulder rode permanently higher than his right, from decades of compensating. Think about that. The man who would kill more people than the Black Death got his start stealing livestock. He was not some born emperor on a golden throne. He was a disabled bandit from the middle of nowhere. By his mid-30s, Timur had clawed his way to power through a series of betrayals so efficient they'd make a Wall Street hostile takeover look clumsy. He allied with a warlord named Hussein, used him to drive out the Mongol rulers of Transoxiana, then had Hussein assassinated and married his widow, Sarai Mulk Khanum, a princess descended directly from Genghis Khan. This wasn't a romance, it was a hostile merger. Saray's bloodline gave Timur something he desperately needed, legitimacy. In the Mongol world, only a descendant of Genghis Khan could hold the title of Khan. Timur solved this by appointing a puppet Khan and ruling from the shadows while calling himself Amir, General. He ordered a banner made, black, with 3 interlocking rings forming a triangle, the symbol of the Sahib Kiran, the Lord of the Fortunate Conjunction. When that banner flew from his tent, every allied clan within riding distance knew it was time to arm themselves and ride. By 1393, Timur turned his empire toward Persia, which was falling apart. The old Muzaffarid dynasty was eating itself alive in succession crises, its great cities defended by local warlords who spent more time fighting each other than preparing for the iron tide rolling in from the east. Timur took Herat first. The city surrendered, then revolted. His son, Miran Shah, a hulking, volatile man who wore a coat of iron lamella plates riveted over boiled leather, and who would later go half mad from a head injury suffered falling from a horse, was sent to crush it. At Herat, Miran Shah built something new, a tower not of stone but of human heads set in raw mortar, the flesh still on the bone. At Isfizar, Timur ordered captured defenders cemented into the city walls alive. At Sabzevar, 2,000 living prisoners were stacked like bricks and packed with mud, left to suffocate inside a monument to their own defiance. These weren't random cruelties. This was a communication strategy. Every tower of heads was a press release written in bone. The message was devastatingly simple: surrender and live, resist and become architecture. And Timur was about to learn that one city hadn't been reading his mail. Isfahan in 1387 was one of the jewels of the Persian world. A city of scholars and astronomers, of carpet markets stretching half a mile, of mosques whose tile work made visitors weep. It was the capital of the Muzaffarid kingdom, home to perhaps 250,000 souls. When Timur's army appeared on the horizon, 70,000 mounted warriors stretching across the plain, the Muzaffarid ruler Shah Hodshah did the only rational thing. He mounted his horse, grabbed his treasury, and rode south for Shiraz without looking back. He left Isfahan to negotiate its own survival. The city's remaining leaders opened the gates. They agreed to pay tribute. They rolled out the carpets, and Timur treated them with what passed for his version of mercy. No massacre, no mass enslavement, just a garrison of 3,000 soldiers left behind to collect taxes. Timur himself rode north, already thinking about his next problem: Toktamish, Khan of the Golden Horde, who had invaded his homeland while his back was turned. This wasn't a conquest, it was a formality. And for about a week it worked. But Timur's tax collectors were not diplomats. They were steppe warriors armed with curved sabers and short composite bows, men who wore pointed iron helmets with aventails of riveted chainmail hanging to their shoulders, and who had been told to extract maximum wealth from a sophisticated urban population. They kicked in doors, they upended workshops, they inventoried family heirlooms. A Mongol cavalryman standing in a Persian scholar's library demanding payment is the 14th century equivalent of sending a SWAT team to audit your taxes. Something snapped. And the man holding the match was not a general or a prince. He was a blacksmith named Ali Kache Pa. And by morning, he would be the most consequential nobody in Persian history. Ali Kache Pa is a man history almost forgot, a craftsman whose name barely survives in the chronicles. What he organized was extraordinary. The revolt of Isfahan was not a spontaneous riot. It was a coordinated assassination plot that unfolded across an entire city in a single night. Isfahan was a city of quarters, neighborhoods organized by trade, each with its own narrow streets and internal logic. Ali sent word through the craftsmen's networks, the tanners, the dyers, the butchers, the weavers, men whose hands were strong from labor, men who owned tools that could kill. On the appointed night, as the Mongol garrison slept in billets scattered across the city, Isfahan woke up and went to work. A tanner's skinning knife, 8 inches of curved steel honed daily on leather strop, slides between the iron rings of a sleeping soldier's chainmail aventail and finds the artery beneath. A butcher's cleaver, heavy as a hatchet and sharp enough to split a sheep's sternum, comes down on the hand reaching for a saber in the dark. A weaver's shuttle pin, a hardened wooden spike 3 inches long, goes through an eye socket. These were not warriors' weapons. These were tools redesigned by desperate men who understood one thing: you don't need to penetrate Mongol armor if you target the gaps where armor doesn't go: the throat, the inner wrist, the armpit, the groin. 3,000 soldiers died before sunrise. Now here's the sick, pitch-black comedy of the situation. And I need you to understand this part, because it tells you everything about how empires actually work. Timur wasn't even there. He was gone. He'd left Isfahan behind as a solved problem, a checked box, a closed deal, and was marching north to handle Toktamish and the Golden Horde. Isfahan was supposed to be the easy part, the city that surrendered, the one he showed mercy. When the messenger reached him, riding hard across the plateau, horse foaming, Timur's war council was deep in logistics for the northern campaign. Imagine the scene. You're an advisor to the most feared man alive, and you have to walk into his tent and tell him that the city he personally pardoned has just murdered his entire garrison, that a blacksmith organized it, that the heads of his tax collectors are displayed on the walls of the very bazaar where they'd been collecting his money. Timur's court chronicler, Nizam al-Din Shami, a slight, meticulous Persian scholar who wore a plain white turban and carried reed pens in a leather case on his belt, a man whose job was to make atrocities sound like divine policy, later wrote that Timur received the news in silence. His advisors knew that silence. They'd heard it at Herat, at Isfizar, at Sabzavar. It was the sound of an equation being solved, and the answer was always subtraction. "Turn the army," Timur said. "Now pause here, because this is the moment where Isfahan's fate is sealed, and the reason it's sealed tells you something terrible about the mathematics of terror." Timur couldn't afford to let this go. Not because he was angry, though he was, but because his entire empire ran on one resource: fear. Every city from Samarkand to Baghdad knew the deal. Surrender, pay, live, revolt, and the towers go up. If Isfahan revolted and got away with it, the deal was broken. Every city behind him would be recalculating. Every governor would be wondering if maybe a blacksmith and a sharp knife was all it took. This wasn't revenge, it was risk management. He turned his entire army around and marched back to Isfahan. 70,000 men, a moving city of war crossing the Persian plateau with a speed that must have seemed supernatural to the scouts watching from Isfahan's walls. The Muzaffarid prince who had fled to Khuzestan to raise a relief army would never arrive in time. He wasn't even close. Isfahan had used its one bullet, and Timur was coming. Dawn 3 days later. The streets of Isfahan are silent, but it is not the silence of surrender. It's the silence of a city holding its breath. Ali Kachepar's blacksmiths have turned every forge in the metalworkers' quarter into a weapons factory. Iron bars hammered into crude spear points, door hinges reshaped into blades. The tanners have boiled leather into stiff breastplates, hardened rawhide that can slow a saber cut if not stop it. The butchers have stockpiled cleavers and bone saws. Across the city, men who built their lives around creation are frantically repurposing everything they have for destruction. On the walls you can see them. Volunteers with slings, with stones ripped from garden walls, with crossbows bought or stolen from the dead Mongol garrison. They look east and they see what's coming. The dust cloud first, then the sound, a low, continuous thunder that isn't thunder, it's hooves, 70,000 horses. Then the glint of iron, catching the pale November sun. Lamellar plates, pointed helmets, thousands of compound bows, each one a killing machine made of layered horn, sinew and wood that could punch an arrow through chainmail at 100 paces. The heat of the forges still hangs in the air. The weight of improvised leather armor pulls at shoulders that were built for hammering, not fighting. Somewhere in the metalworkers' quarter, a man who spent his life making horseshoes is now testing the balance of a weapon he forged in 3 hours. It will have to do. Timur's army does not storm the walls immediately. That is not his way. He surrounds the city first, cutting off every road, every path, every goat trail. Isfahan becomes an island. Then he sends sappers to undermine the weakest sections of wall, men with picks and shovels working in teams, protected by archers who drop any defender who shows himself above the parapet. Isfahan's walls are a problem, but not for the reason you'd think. These walls were built to define a city, not defend one. They are high enough to look impressive, not thick enough to absorb the impact of a ram. Timur doesn't even need rams. His engineers identify the points where centuries of repair have left the stone mismatched, the mortar crumbling, and they concentrate there. The breach opens on the eastern wall in the early afternoon. It's not dramatic, there's no explosion, no sudden collapse. Just a slow, grinding failure, stones tumbling inward, dust rising, and then the gap is wide enough for horses. The first Timurid cavalry comes through at speed. These are not line troops. These are vanguard raiders, men on fast step ponies wearing minimal armor, carrying compound bows and light sabers. Their job isn't to conquer, it's to create panic. They ride into a kill zone. Ali Kachepar's craftsmen have spent 3 days preparing for this moment. And what they've built inside the breach is an ambush that would make a professional engineer nod with respect. The narrow streets behind the eastern wall have been barricaded with overturned carts, piled furniture, and the doors ripped from workshops. The gaps between barricades are just wide enough for one horse, and at each gap, men wait with weapons designed for exactly this kind of fight. The first riders through the breach hit the barricades and stall. A horse cannot jump a chest-high wall of oak planks and iron fittings in a space 8 feet wide. The riders rein up, and that half-second pause is all it takes. A tanner's knife, hooked, designed for stripping hide from carcass, catches the gap between a rider's iron helmet and his chainmail collar. A blacksmith's hammer, 4 pounds of iron on a 2-foot handle, hits a horse in the knee joint. The animal screams and drops. The rider goes down into the street, and 3 men with improvised weapons are on him before his sword clears the scabbard. This wasn't a battle. It was butcher's work in a butcher's alley. And for the first 20 minutes, the craftsmen of Isfahan are winning it. But here's the thing about Timur's army that the defenders of Isfahan were about to learn the hard way. These men didn't panic. They were organized in decimal units, squads of 10, companies of 100, regiments of 1,000, divisions of 10,000. A system inherited from Genghis Khan and refined over a century of continuous warfare. When the vanguard stalled in the kill zone, they didn't keep pouring in. They pulled back, reformed, and sent a different kind of force. Now here's the first misconception I need to correct. In pop culture, Mongol Timurid armies are depicted as screaming barbarian hordes, a mindless wave of savagery. That is propaganda, the same kind of propaganda European chroniclers used against every Central Asian army for 1,000 years. Timur's troops were among the most disciplined military professionals on the planet. And the proof is what they did next. Instead of charging through the breach again, Timur's engineers widened it. Sappers worked under arrow cover, pulling stone from both sides, turning a gap for 1 horse into a highway for 10. Meanwhile, a second force scaled the walls 300 yards south, using hooked ladders, and dropped into the city behind the craftsmen's defensive line. The ambush at the eastern breach, Ali's masterpiece, was now a trap with the walls on 3 sides and Timurid soldiers on the 4th. The fighting in the metalworkers' quarter lasted hours. The blacksmiths fought with hammers and tongs and crude iron blades that bent against Timurid lamellar armor, overlapping plates of hardened leather and iron laced together with sinew, designed to distribute the force of a blow across the entire torso. A hammer strike that would crack a man's ribs bounced off lamellar plate and bruised the arm beneath. But the craftsmen adapted. They aimed low, targeting knees and ankles below the armor skirt. They targeted hands. A man whose fingers are broken cannot grip a saber. They fought in teams, one man pulling a soldier's shield aside while another drove a spike at the exposed armpit where no plate covered the gap. And still it wasn't enough. The Timurid forces that came through the widened breach were heavy cavalry, men in full lamellar from throat to knee, riding armored horses, carrying lances 12 feet long. In the narrow streets, those lances were useless, but the heavy cavalry wasn't there to lance anyone. They were a wall. A wall of horse and iron moving slowly through the streets, compressing the defenders into tighter and tighter spaces, pushing them back toward the city center. Behind the cavalry came the dismounted infantry with sabers and short thrusting swords, weapons designed for exactly this kind of close-quarter urban killing. The craftsmen of Isfahan fought building by building. They dropped tiles from rooftops. They poured boiling dye from the tanneries, not oil, they didn't have oil, but chromium-laced tanning liquid that burned skin on contact and blinded men who caught it in the eyes. A Timurid soldier on the street below takes a faceful of hot tannic acid and tears at his helmet, screaming, exposing his throat. The man next to him steps over the body and keeps advancing. This wasn't a rout. It was compression, like a fist slowly closing. The Timurid army squeezed Isfahan's defenders into smaller and smaller pockets, cutting them off from each other, turning a citywide resistance into 100 isolated last stands. In the carpet market, weavers fought with iron shuttle rods. In the butcher's quarter, men who understood anatomy fought with cleavers aimed at every seam in Timurid armor. In the scholar's district, men who had never touched a weapon held brass astrolabes and ceramic inkwells and threw them at soldiers wearing 40 pounds of combat gear, and they must have known, that it would accomplish nothing. They fought anyway. That is the part the chronicles don't know what to do with. By late afternoon, organized resistance is over. The barricades are broken or bypassed. Ali Kache Pa's metalworkers' quarter, the heart of the revolt, has been overrun. What happened to Ali himself? History doesn't record. He vanishes from the sources the way most ordinary people vanish from history, mid-sentence without an ending. He was there, and then he wasn't, and 70,000 men poured into the gap he left behind. Timur entered the conquered city on his Nisaean stallion as the sun dropped toward the horizon. He surveyed the barricades, the improvised weapons, the boiled leather breastplates. According to Nizam al-Din Shami, who was there with his reed pens and his white turban, Timur said nothing about the resistance. No praise, no anger. He simply issued the order. 1 head per soldier, 20 dinars per head. Begin. What happened next was not a battle. It was a quota system. Timur's soldiers went door to door, quarter by quarter, street by street. The people who had fought were already dead or dying. The people who remained were the ones who had hidden, in cellars, in attics, behind false walls, inside bread ovens. Families pressed together in the dark, listening to boots on stone. The women of Isfahan did something the chroniclers note with a particular stunned respect. Many threw themselves from rooftops. Not in panic, in choice. They chose the method and the moment. And here is where the most grotesque comedy in military history unfolds. And I need to tell it beat by beat, because it reveals more about human nature than any philosophy lecture ever could. 20 dinars per head was a generous bounty, a working soldier's monthly pay roughly for a few minutes of ugly work. So the first wave of killing was enthusiastic. Soldiers fanned out, quotas were filled quickly, and heads were delivered to the counting stations set up at the major intersections. Actual counting stations, with clerks, with ledgers, with scales for weighing silver. Then something unexpected happened. Some soldiers couldn't do it. They could fight an armed man in battle. They could storm a wall under fire. But standing in a room with a family huddled in the corner, children clinging to parents, some of them found a line they didn't know they had, and they didn't cross it. But they still needed a head. So they bought one. A soldier who had killed 3 people and only needed 1 head for his quota could sell the surplus at a markup. The price of a head on the first day was about 14 dinars, a 6 dinar discount from the official bounty, a tidy profit for the seller, a moral bargain for the buyer. I didn't kill anyone. I just bought the evidence that someone else did. By the second day, supply was outstripping demand. Heads dropped to 10 dinars, then 8, then 5. An actual economy of murder emerged, with wholesalers and middlemen, and this is the part that makes you want to stop telling the story. Some entrepreneurs started checking the quality. Older heads, decomposed heads, heads from people who had already been dead before the massacre. Counterfeit heads, essentially. The clerks at the counting stations started rejecting them. Quality control for severed heads. In the middle of the greatest atrocity in 14th century Persia, men were arguing about depreciation. When the tally reached 70,000, Timur ordered the killing to stop, not out of mercy, because the math was done. He had spent the equivalent of a small fortune in silver, and the returns were diminishing. He'd simply run out of budget for murder. The accountant in him shut it down before the general even considered it. And then came the architecture. The heads were not discarded, they were organized. Timur's engineers, men who had built bridges and siege towers and irrigation systems, oversaw the construction of 28 towers along the main roads leading into and out of Isfahan. Each tower contained approximately 1,500 heads, stacked and cemented into place with mortar, built for visibility. An eyewitness, not a chronicler writing years later, but someone who walked the roads afterward, counted them. 28 towers, 1,500 heads each, visible for miles across the flat Persian plain. These weren't piles. They were structures, Someone calculated the base width needed for stability. Someone oversaw the mortar ratio. Someone arranged the faces outward so travelers approaching Isfahan from any direction would meet their gaze. This wasn't a punishment. It was a billboard. And every city between Isfahan and the borders of China could read it. The buildings of Isfahan, the mosques, the markets, the observatories, the libraries, were left standing. Timur destroyed no architecture in Isfahan. He only added to it. The killing stopped. Then Timur did something that tells you more about him than all the skulls in Persia. He sent his men back into the city, not with swords, but with lists. They went door to door again, but this time they were looking for survivors with specific qualifications: calligraphers, architects, tile workers, astronomers, poets, anyone with what Timur considered the divine spark. These people were not killed, they were collected. Like rare manuscripts pulled from a burning library. They were loaded onto carts and sent 800 miles east to Samarkand, where Timur was building something that would outlast every army he ever commanded. Here is the contradiction that will keep you up at night. The same man who had just ordered 28 towers of skulls spent his afternoons reviewing tile designs for mosque domes. In Samarkand, he was constructing turquoise tiled madrasas so beautiful that visitors 6 centuries later still stop breathing when they walk through the doors. He laid out gardens designed by the finest landscape architects in the Islamic world, architects he had kidnapped from the very cities he had burned. He commissioned calligraphy so exquisite that scholars traveled from Cairo to see it. And above the gates of Samarkand, Timur ordered an inscription carved in stone: "If you doubt our might, look at our buildings." This wasn't a contradiction between art and destruction. It was the same blade, double-edged. Morning, fill the quota. Afternoon, review the blueprints. This was the scissors of Timur. 2 blades, creation and destruction, opened as wide as they could go. But here is the moment, the one I've been building toward. The scene that changes how you see everything that came before. February 1405. 18 years after Isfahan. Timur is nearly 70. He is freezing, feverish, carried in a litter across the snow-covered steppe because he can no longer ride. He has 200,000 soldiers behind him, and he's marching toward China, Ming China, the only power left that hasn't bent to him, in the dead of winter, against the advice of every general he has. His doctors pack him in ice to bring the fever down, which is exactly the wrong treatment. But nobody alive is going to tell Timur no. They stop in Otrar, a city on the edge of modern Kazakhstan. Timur knows he is dying. He summons his wives and his commanders to his bedside. According to the Arab biographer Ahmad ibn Arab Shah, who despised Timur and would have no reason to invent this, the conversation went like this. Timur spoke in a voice so weak his commanders had to lean in to hear. "Do not weep," he said. "Do not run about tearing your clothes, pray. Pray that God will have mercy on me." One of his wives began to sob. Timur raised his ruined right hand, the one missing 2 fingers from that sheep-stealing raid half a century earlier, and said, "I have always known what I was. Bury me at the feet of my teacher." He meant Mir Said Baraka, the Sufi saint descended from the Prophet Muhammad, a frail old man in a plain white robe and green turban who had traveled with Timur for decades, blessing his campaigns, watching the towers go up, saying nothing. Baraka had been buried in the Gur-e-Amir, the family mausoleum in Samarkand. Timur didn't ask to be buried beside him, not above him, at his feet. The conqueror of the world wanted to spend eternity prostrate before a holy man, begging forgiveness. On his tomb, they carved the inscription he had dictated. "Happy is he who renounced the world before the world renounced him." On the jade slab sealing his coffin, they carved a second line. "When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble." Remember the baby born with blood in his fist? The boy his father named Iron. He died asking a dead saint to intercede with God on behalf of a sinner. That is not a battle scene, but it is the most devastating thing Timur ever did, because it proves he understood the entire time exactly what he was doing. Every city, every tower, every head. He was keeping count in the same ledger God was. 536 years later, in June 1941, a Soviet anthropologist named Mikhail Gerasimov pried open that coffin on Joseph Stalin's orders. He wanted to measure the skull, to confirm scientifically that Timur had really been lame. 3 old men from Samarkand brought an old manuscript to the excavation site and begged Gerasimov not to open the tomb. He waved them away with a stick. Inside the coffin, beneath the scent of rosewater and musk, he found a second inscription: "Whoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." 2 days later, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. Now, that's a coincidence. Curses aren't real, but Stalin wasn't sure. The most powerful atheist on earth quietly ordered Timur's remains returned to Samarkand and reburied with full Islamic rites in November 1942. 5 weeks later, the Red Army won the Battle of Stalingrad. 6 centuries after his death, Timur was still doing what he had always done, making powerful men act against their own reason. Isfahan is still there. It is one of the most beautiful cities in Iran. The mosques still stand. The tilework still glitters. The towers are long gone. Bone and mortar don't last the way turquoise and stone do. But in Uzbekistan, Timur's statue replaced Karl Marx in the capital. His face is on the currency. Presidents quote him in speeches. They remember the buildings, not the bones. And there it is. The truth that sits at the bottom of every history book like sediment no one wants to stir. We don't judge conquerors by what they did. We judge them by who they did it to. Alexander gets a movie. Genghis Khan gets a mini-series. Timur, who killed 17 million human beings, 5% of the world's population, who turned mass murder into urban planning and built pyramids of skulls as public policy, gets a statue and a thank you letter from the King of England, depending on which direction you're looking from. We prefer the beautiful destruction to the ugly truth. We always have. If this story changed how you think about history, about power, about the stories we choose to tell and the ones we bury under tile and turquoise, subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And I'll see you in the next one.